New Zealand's Institute for the Law of the Sea and a researcher with the Utrecht Center for Water, Oceans and Sustainability Law. He is a member of the Committee on the Role of the International Law in Sustainable Natural Resources Management for Development of the International Association, and a guest lecturer for Amnesty International The Hague. And Dr. Otto Spijkers has a multidisciplinary background in international relations, international law, and philosophy. So today, we have a good honor to have Dr. Spijkers give us an analysis of the international legal framework relating to construction of artificial islands in the EEZ. As we all know, according to Article 60 of the UNCLOS, coast states have the right to build artificial islands in their EEZ, but should consider other states' rights. But how there's some something must be clarified. So, as to international law and as to international politics and to international global maritime management. So today we have Dr. Otto Spijkers will give us an international law perspective. So welcome and so you can begin.
Yes, thank you very much. I use this microphone.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. So thank you to Professor Song for inviting me. She's not here, I know, but we just had lunch this early afternoon. So I will indeed provide you with an analysis of the international legal framework relating to the construction of artificial islands in the exclusive economic zone. I am myself from the Netherlands, so I will focus a bit on situation in the Netherlands, but I will basically be talking about international law only, not about Dutch law. So what I'm going to say is based on a report that we wrote for the Netherlands government, but everything I'm going to say would also apply to China or to any other state with an exclusive economic zone. So let me tell you a little bit about the background of this research. What I'm going to tell you is based on a report that was commissioned by the Netherlands Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Policy. So they asked us to look at certain international legal issues relating to the construction of artificial islands. And I will explain you in a minute why they asked us that question. Of course, it had political and actual relevance. I mean, when the government asks a group of scholars to do some research, it's not out of academic curiosity, but they are actually planning to do something with this report. So I will explain to you in a minute what was behind the request. I have to say that I wrote this report together with Professor Alex Oude-Elfering, the director of the Netherlands Institute for the Law of the Sea, of which I'm a senior research associate. So we wrote this report together. So I'm also going, when I present this report, I also do it on his behalf. The report is freely available online, so you can download it from the website of the Netherlands Institute for the Law of the Sea. But before you get too enthusiastic, it's written in Dutch. So if you do not speak Dutch, and I guess most of you are not very competent in my language, then it's of little use. But we do have the ambition to base an academic English language article on this report. So it might be available in some form or another soon also in English. But if you're interested, it's already available in Dutch at the website of the Netherlands Institute for the Law of the Sea. So a little bit about what motivated the ministry to ask us to do the research that we did. Well, basically, this is the Netherlands exclusive economic zone. And these are the plans that the Netherlands government has to exploit its resources and other opportunities. So as you can see, the Netherlands EEZ is relatively big. It's bigger than our land territory. So our sea territory is about 1.5 times the size of our land territory. So we are lucky in a sense. Because if you compare our exclusive economic zone to that of our neighbor Germany, Germany has a very concave coast, so they are unlucky. So they are a big country, big land territory, but they have a relatively small exclusive economic zone. And ours is relatively big, but as you know, we are situated at the North Sea. So our exclusive economic zone at some point collides with that of the United Kingdom to the north, to that of Germany to the east, say, and to that of Belgium to the south. So we never have the full 200 nautical miles that we would otherwise be entitled to. So we had to delimit our exclusive economic zone with our neighbors, and this we have done successfully. And then this is what remains, a little piece of water pie. And we want to make full use of that exclusive economic zone. And there are various ways to make use of the exclusive economic zone. So here you see a list on the slide of the opportunities. So the exclusive economic zone can be used for renewable energy, and then our focus is on wind turbines. Because the Netherlands is a very windy place, we hardly ever have sunshine. It's always raining in the Netherlands, so we don't have much use for solar panels. But it is always windy in the Netherlands, and of course you can also extract wind energy from wind. Also there are surface minerals in the sea. Oil and gas extraction. We have quite some oil and gas platforms in our EZ. To meet our nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, we are also considering to store greenhouse gas emissions, so CO2, in the sea or under the sea. Cables and pipelines, they are mainly used for internet, to be connected. Shipping, the North Sea is a very busy shipping route. So a lot of ships pass through the North Sea. We also undertake military exercises in our EEZ. So certain parts of the EEZ are designated for military training, so defense purposes. There's quite a lot of fishing going on in the North Sea. Also aquaculture, so the growing of oysters and so on. Underwater cultural heritage, well, I don't know how many treasures there are hidden in our EZ. And tourism and recreation. We also use our EZ for tourism and recreation. So there's a lot of different purposes for which we could exploit the EZ. And some you can combine, but others are a bit harder to combine. So all this exploitation of the EZ requires very dense regulation. So I just give you an example. Here you see the harbor of Zeebrugge. It's a harbor situated in Belgium, but very near the border with the Netherlands. And there used to be just one wind park in front of it. But now there are plans to build additional wind parks. And you see how complicated then the situation gets. So now we had to regulate the shipping, so the shipping routes. It's now subject to a very complicated regulation. because those ships, they have to avoid the wind park area so that they don't collapse into those turbines and sink. So very dense regulation and very close coordination with our neighbors, our Belgian neighbors. So let's first look to the future. So what are the plans? Here again you see the map. And what I wanted to point your attention to is, well, basically almost all the areas have some shade of green, so it's a bit hard to distinguish one from the other. But the green areas that are a bit darker green, most of them are in the north. Those are Nature 2000 areas, so they are nature reserves or marine protected areas. So those areas are reserved for nature, and economic activity is very limited or non-existent there. So those areas reserved for nature. And then these slightly lighter green areas, those are the areas that are reserved for wind parks. And you see that there's quite a lot of them. So they are a bit closer to the coast, but they are still far beyond the territorial zone. So the yellow line is our territorial sea, is the boundary between the territorial sea and the exclusive economic zone. And as you'll see, most of the wind parks that we plan to build or authorize corporations to build, they are outside the territorial sea. So they are in the exclusive economic zone of the Netherlands. So far outside the coast. And that is important because increasingly people in the Netherlands, they complain about what we call horizon pollution. And so in the past, when you look out to the sea, you just see this emptiness. But increasingly often, you see all these wind turbines at the horizon. And some people, they get really frustrated by this, so they complain. And the government takes those complaints very seriously, so now the idea is to have those wind turbines, those wind parks, situated way, way, way outside the coast, so that they are hardly visible to the naked eye. But there are other reasons too, to have them situated so far away. But of course that creates some new technical issues, because the energy that is generated from the wind then has to be transported to the land territory. So we need some innovative ways to do this. So as you can see, most of these wind parks have not been constructed yet. So only those few bit darker spots on the map, those are already existing wind parks. But basically almost all of it is not yet constructed. So why do we build so many wind parks, or why do we plan to build so many wind parks? That is again to meet our obligations under the Paris Agreement. So we have now our economy relies mostly on gas and oil, but we have to transfer to more sustainable energy resources. And one way, at least that's the government's policy, one way is to build lots of wind parks in the EZ. We're also going to build lots of wind parks on our land territory, but that is of no consequence for the present lecture. You see again that quite significant parts of the EZ are also reserved for military training. And sometimes the areas reserved for military training overlap with the marine protected areas, so the nature reserve. So that is apparently, those two uses can be combined. I sometimes have this impression, but maybe you don't share that with me, that we are a bit over-exploiting and over-regulating our sea. You know, in the past, there was something romantic about the ocean. So you would take a little boat and then you sail into the ocean, and then nobody would bother you, the freedom of the high seas. the ocean had lots of mystery to it. There's all these stories about monsters or big whales in the oceans that you then hunt. All these mysteries. It seems that now with this very dense regulation that's going on, we sort of lose that sense of mystery to the ocean. So that is why I have this picture on the slide. It's actually my father that you see on the picture, who is dressed up like a traditional fisherman, and he's on his way to the ocean. So the ministry asked us for legal advice. So what exactly did they want to know from us? They asked us, actually they consulted with us. So together with Professor Alex Oude Elfrink and myself, they came up with the following questions. Who has the right to construct and authorize and regulate the construction, operation and use of artificial islands in the Netherlands EEZ? What are the limits to the activities that may be allowed on an artificial island? What is the definition of the term artificial island, and what is its relationship with terms of a similar category, like installation and structure, or vessel, ship? And how is ownership of an artificial island in the Netherlands EEZ regulated? And what are the rights of third states in relation to artificial islands constructed in the EEZ of the Netherlands? So those were the questions that the government asked us to look into. And yeah, we did our very best to come up with a reply to all these questions. So those questions will also provide basically the structure of my presentation. So I will answer those questions, and in the end I will return to them and give you brief answers to all 5 of them. So what was our research methodology? Well, basically we were asked to interpret the Law of the Sea Convention. Because the Netherlands is a party to the Law of the Sea Convention. The Law of the Sea Convention is the constitution of the oceans. So basically everything relating to the exclusive economic zone is regulated in that convention. So what we basically had to do is engage in an old-fashioned exercise of treaty interpretation. And as you all know, I'm sure, there are rules to how you interpret a treaty. And those rules you find in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. And so we had to follow the rules or the methodology of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. And Article 31 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties basically tells us you have to focus on the ordinary meaning of the terms used in the convention. And so just look at what it says and then try to elucidate what it means. But there are also subsidiary means for interpretation, and one of them is to look at the travaux préparatoires, the documents that sort of led to the convention, so the drafting process of the convention. And as I'm sure you know, the drafting of the Law of the Sea Convention took a long time. So that's the third United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which took a decade to complete. And we looked at some of the important discussions on artificial islands that form part of that drafting process, of the travaux préparatoires. And then one working paper that caught our attention is a working paper that was submitted by the Belgian delegation, which focused solely on artificial islands and installations. So it's a paper that was quite influential, but not all proposals made by Belgium actually made it into the convention. But I still think it is interesting for present purposes to look at this working paper and see what the Belgians proposed and what were the ideas behind these proposals. What the Belgian delegation, I think, rightly pointed out is that there are essentially two main issues when it comes to artificial islands. First, the question of jurisdiction. So who has jurisdiction over these artificial islands? And then the second question is who has the right to construct such islands or authorize its construction? Because I'm sure you realize that in today's world, it's almost never the government itself that constructs those islands. It's always some private corporation, an oil company or an energy company that does the construction, but then they need the authorization from the coastal state. So jurisdiction over artificial islands, that's one big issue, and the other issue is who has the right to construct or authorize the construction of artificial islands in the exclusive economic zone. So the Belgian working paper rightly identifies those two as the essential questions in relation to artificial islands. Firstly, that of the jurisdiction to which they are subject, and secondly, that of the right of states to erect such structures and the conditions which they must observe in doing so. The working paper, the Belgian working paper, then first turns to the jurisdictional aspect. And what I find funny is that they first say, and this is a quote from the working paper, that the aspect of jurisdiction does not seem to raise any real problems from the standpoint of the development of international law of the sea. I think there they underestimated a bit the issue, because it does create actually quite some problems. So why did the Belgians believe that the issue of jurisdiction was pretty straightforward? Well, because the question of jurisdiction does not concern floating islands, which in view of their notional mobility could be treated as vessels, but only that of permanent islands supported on the seabed or the ocean floor. So this is interesting because the Belgians made a distinction between movable structures and immovable ones. And in the view of the Belgians, only those that were immovable should qualify as artificial islands. So structures that move are not artificial islands. I will turn to those definitional questions in a minute. But just keep them in the back of your mind. This is also an issue that needs to be resolved. What is an artificial island and how is it different from an installation or a structure or a vessel? So I will explain later what the difference is between those terms. But in any case, the Belgians rightly identified that as an issue to be resolved. And then the Belgians made a distinction between artificial islands erected in the territorial sea, in the high seas, and on the continental shelf. So those are the three different zones that they distinguished. So according to the Belgians, the situation in the territorial sea is easy because it is self-evident that any islands erected in the territorial sea are subject to the jurisdiction of the coastal state. So that's clear. Any island constructed in the territorial sea belongs to the, or doesn't belong to the coastal state, but is under the exclusive jurisdiction of the coastal state. Islands erected beyond the limits of any state's national jurisdiction, so in areas beyond any state's national jurisdiction, would fall under the jurisdiction of some international machinery to be established. That was the Belgian proposal. So that would then now be the International Seabed Authority. So let's forget about that scenario because what concerns us is the exclusive economic zone. So what did the Belgians contemplate for the exclusive economic zone? Well, the Belgians refer to the continental shelf because this concept of EZ was introduced later. But in view of the Belgian working paper, artificial islands supported on the continental shelf could be made subject either to the jurisdiction of the coastal state or to that of the state which authorized its construction. So the Belgians did allow for a possibility that a state other than the coastal state would authorize the construction of artificial islands in a stage EZ. That is interesting, and as I will explain to you later, that's not entirely how the Law of the Sea Convention eventually regulates the issue. The Belgians also made a distinction between artificial installations necessary for the exploration and exploitation of natural resources of the continental shelf and installations established for any other purpose. So they made a distinction between installations used for economic purposes, well, more specifically for exploration and exploitation of the natural resources of the continental shelf, and installations established for any other purpose. And especially the latter category, so installations established for purposes other than for the exploitation and exploration of natural resources, that is a bit of a controversial category, because, well, what could be a purpose other than exploration and exploitation of natural resources? Any idea? Well, the most controversial is installations for military purposes, that are used for military purposes, for spying, for example. So this is something that needed to be regulated. So the issue of jurisdiction, as you'll see, is not as easy, as unproblematic as the Belgians may have made you believe. Okay, then now turn to the other issue. The second problem, that is the right to construct or authorize construction of artificial islands. So according to the Belgian working paper, this was a much more problematic question than the question of jurisdiction. So what the Belgian working paper rightly pointed out at the start is that only states can have the right to construct or authorize the construction of artificial islands. So private individuals or corporations cannot claim that right, since the law of the sea is public law. So the law of the sea applies only between states and regulates rights and obligations of states, and only states have the right to construct or authorize the construction of artificial islands, period. This is not a right that belongs to corporations or to individuals. So they are subject to licensing program or authorization from the state. They need the authorization to construct an artificial islands from a state. What the Belgian working paper also points out is that the right to construct an artificial island, even in your own exclusive economic zone, is not a right without restrictions. Because you have to pay due regard to the rights of other states. Because in the exclusive economic zone, some high seas freedoms apply. And so other states have the right to navigate through your exclusive economic zone, for example. They have the right to lay pipelines and cables, and they have other high seas freedoms. I will tell you a bit more about that in a minute. So when you construct or authorize the construction of an artificial island in your EZ, you have to pay due regard to those rights of other states. Also, you have to ensure the safety on and in the vicinity of that artificial island. So you have to make sure that the safety zone is established around it. And you also have to guarantee the safety on the island itself. Again, I will say a bit more about it later. But the Belgians already figured out that the right to construct or authorize the construction of artificial islands and installations in your own exclusive economic zone is not an unlimited right. So that's the Belgian proposal. And I think it's interesting because it shows you a little bit the discussions that were going on in relation to artificial islands, to the part on artificial island construction. But for present purposes, it's of course much more important to look at how the provisions in the Loft Sea Convention relating to artificial islands ultimately ended up being formulated. That's more important than to look at the working paper of the Belgian delegation. Because what we're going to look at now, that is actually the law as it currently applies. So let's look at the relevant provisions in the Loft Sea Convention and begin with Article 56. You see it now on the slides. Article 56 is not exclusively about artificial islands, and it is also, I will give this away already now, is not the most important of the provisions in the Loft Sea Convention, but it's a good starting point. Because Article 56, in a general sense, introduces the rights, jurisdiction and duties of the coastal state in its exclusive economic zone. So Article 56 again speaks of rights and of jurisdiction, as the Belgian proposal did. So those are the two essential issues. Let's first look at rights. So in the exclusive economic zone, the coastal state has sovereign rights for the purpose of exploring and exploiting, conserving and managing the natural resources, whether living or non-living, of the waters superjacent to the seabed and of the seabed and its subsoil, and with regard to other activities for the economic exploitation and exploration of the zone, such as the production of energy from water, currents and winds. So the rights of the coastal state in its exclusive economic zone seem to be limited to rights for the purpose of exploring and exploiting the natural resources in that zone. And reference is made, for example, to extracting energy from wind. So wind parks obviously fall within the scope of Article 56. But taking oil from the shelf might also fall within that category, although such rights are more related to continental shelf and not to the water column. But fishing is a good example. So those are the sovereign rights. The right to establish artificial islands is not mentioned explicitly in Article 56, paragraph 1, sub A. But, of course, if artificial islands are constructed for the purpose of exploring and exploiting the natural resources of the zone, then Article 56, paragraph 1, sub A could be used as a legal basis for the right to construct such artificial islands. Article 56, paragraph 1, sub B also, Article 56, paragraph 1, sub B deals with jurisdiction. So, in the exclusive economic zone, the coastal state has jurisdiction as provided for in the relevant provisions of the Loft Sea Convention with regard to the establishment and use of artificial islands, installations and structures. So Article 56, paragraph 1, sub B, under little I, gives the coastal state jurisdiction over artificial islands, installations and structures. So that is the basis for jurisdiction. Article 56, paragraph 2 is important because it reads, in exercising its rights and performing its duties under the Law of the Sea Convention in the exclusive economic zone, the coastal state shall have due regard to the rights and duties of other states and shall act in a manner compatible with the provisions of this convention. So this due regard, I'm going to say a bit more about that in a minute, because it's a very important term. It refers to that idea of the Belgian working paper that the right to construct or authorize the construction of an artificial island in your own EZ has its limits. You have to pay due regard to the other states who have some high seas freedoms also in the EZ of the Netherlands. The relationship between Article 56 and Article 60, which I will be discussing in a minute, is interesting. I will maybe explain that in a minute in more detail, but there seems to be a kind of tension between the two articles. Because as we will see in a minute, Article 60 gives the coastal state the exclusive right to construct artificial islands, and also it will give the coastal state exclusive jurisdiction over such islands. But the interesting thing is that the right to construct or authorize the construction of artificial islands in Article 60 is not limited to islands built for the purpose of exploring and exploiting the natural resources of the zone. And so all kinds of artificial islands serving all kinds of purposes fall within the scope of Article 60, which means that the coastal state has the exclusive right to construct or authorize the construction of artificial islands, also if they are made for the purposes for purposes other than exploring and exploiting natural resources. So think of military purposes. Okay, what's happening? So here you have Article 60. So this is by far the most important article in the Law of the Sea Convention as far as it relates to artificial islands. Article 60. In the exclusive economic zone, the coastal state shall have the exclusive right to construct and to authorize and regulate the construction, operation and use of artificial islands. And that is Article 60, paragraph 1, sub A. It also has the exclusive right to authorize the construction, operation and use of installations and structures, but then only those for the purposes provided for in Article 56 and other economic purposes. So there's a difference between the right, you see, because now it's getting a bit complicated. There's a difference between the right to construct artificial islands, which is not limited to islands constructed for a particular purpose, and the right to construct installations and structures, because the exclusive right of the coastal state to construct or authorize the construction of installations and structures is limited to those constructed for the purposes provided in Article 56, so for the exploration and exploitation of natural resources and other economic purposes. So it's a bit unclear what to conclude from this. So one conclusion, one possible conclusion is that the construction of military installations is not an exclusive right of the coastal state. So states other than the coastal state would have the right to construct or authorize the construction of military installations or structures in another state's EZ. But that does not apply to artificial islands. So the coastal state has the exclusive right to construct or authorize the construction of artificial islands for all purposes, including military purposes. So there's a big difference between the right to construct artificial islands and the right to construct installations and structures. And that is not an example of bad drafting. This distinction was deliberately made. But what to make of it exactly is a bit tricky. So some states interpret it in one way, other states interpret it in another way. I want to put emphasis on the fact that the right and the jurisdiction referred to in Article 60 are of an exclusive nature. So that basically means that no other state has this right. So it's not a right that is shared with any other state. That's what exclusivity means. And so only the coastal state can construct and authorize artificial islands in its exclusive economic zone. No other state is allowed to do so. The same applies to installations and structures, but only those that serve the purpose provided in Article 56 and other economic purposes. The exclusivity also attaches to the jurisdiction. So the coastal state has exclusive jurisdiction over artificial islands, installations and structures referred to in Article 1, sub A, B and C. And so the right to legislate, to enforce jurisdiction, policing, is all an exclusive right of the coastal state. So this is the most important, Article 60. So let me now share with you some of my or our reflections. After we did our research, we came up with, or we identified some interesting legal issues that would deserve further research or that have some intricate, controversial aspects to them. First, the definitional question. So what exactly is an artificial island? If there is one thing the Law of the Sea Convention is not very good at, is at providing definitions, because it basically doesn't define any of the terms that it uses. So in the Law of the Sea Convention, you find no definition of an artificial island. It's not defined anywhere. So what do we do? Well, this is a question of interpretation, so we refer to the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties, Article 31, paragraph 1, which says that, I quote, "A treaty shall be interpreted in good faith in accordance with the ordinary meaning to be given to the terms of the treaty, in their context and in the light of its object and purpose." So we have to look to the treaty context, and one way of doing so is to look at whether maybe the term island is used elsewhere in the convention, and then to find some consistent interpretation. Because presumably an artificial island is a subcategory of a larger category of islands. So then we could distinguish between natural islands and artificial islands. So Article 121 of the Law of the Sea Convention does define the term island as a naturally formed area of land surrounded by water which is above water at high tide. And so an island, a natural island, is a naturally formed area of land, so not artificially formed, not made by man, surrounded by water and above water at high tide. So basically it's always above water at high and at low tide. And so that distinguishes an island from a low tide elevation which is submerged at high tides. Also an island is generally distinguished from a rock. So a rock is also above water at both high and low tide, but then a rock doesn't allow for human habitation. So the difference between an island and a rock is that on a rock you cannot live, and on an island you could live. It provides the resources needed for human habitation. So that's an island. I guess many of you are familiar with these terms because you all know the South China Sea arbitration, I guess. Initiated between the Philippines, by the Philippines against China. And one of the contentious issues was whether these maritime features in the South China Sea, whether they could be qualified as island, rock, or low tide elevation. And then the arbitration concluded that there were no islands in the South China Sea. So at best some of these features were low tide elevations. And low tide elevations only give you a territorial zone, but not an exclusive economic zone. Anyway, so what is then an artificial island? So how can we be inspired by this definition of a natural island? How does that help us in defining the term artificial island? Well, by logical analogy, you would argue that an artificial island is a artificially formed area of land surrounded by water, which is above water at high tide. It's that easy. So an artificial island is always above water, but instead of being naturally formed, it's formed by man, by human activity. But the regime of islands, as defined in Article 121 of the Law of the Sea Convention, and the regime of artificial islands, as defined in Article 60, really has to be distinguished. So I don't think you should too easily apply elements of the regime of 121 to artificial islands. In any case, Article 121 makes very clear that an artificial island does not give you any maritime zones. It doesn't give you a territorial zone, doesn't give you exclusive economic zone. So that is an artificial island. So how do you distinguish this then from an installation, a structure, or a vessel or ship? Well, again, the Law of the Sea Convention does not provide us with definitions. So there's no definition of an installation, there's no definition of a structure, there's not even a definition of a vessel. But if you look at the travaux préparatoires and also at scholarship, I think the better view is probably that the difference between an artificial island on the one hand and an installation on the other is that an installation is like an island, immovable and solid construction, but it is not made of island-like materials, like gravel, rock, and sand. So think of oil platforms, for example, that are built on metal pillars. So the difference between an installation and an artificial island is that artificial islands, they look more like islands, but then they are made by man instead of nature. So that could be a way to distinguish installations from structures. So then structures could be movable, floating, and installations would in general be immovable. That would be a useful way to distinguish installations from structures. So I don't know if any of you is familiar with the ocean cleanup. This this device by Boyan Slat, a compatriot of mine. He designed these huge structures that basically collect plastic from the ocean. So they are huge structures, and they just sort of float in these gyres, so these streams where all the plastic is gathering. And then what he attempts to do is to catch the plastic and then bring it to shore. So those are movable because they don't stay in one and the same place. They follow the currents in the oceans. But maybe they are not properly qualified as vessels or ships because they are not used for navigation. They basically follow the current, so they cannot be used to go from one place to the other like ships, but they are also not artificial islands or installations because they move, they constantly move. So that's sort of in between category. So what is an artificial island good for? What purpose does it serve? And in our research we actually found a lot of very creative ideas. So as I showed you at the beginning of my lecture, the Netherlands basically is interested in artificial islands for the purpose of extracting energy from wind. So to make wind parks and wind turbines. But in the research we found that there are lots of other purposes. So you could make artificial islands, you could construct them to make a city at sea, a city. Why not? You could use them for tourism and recreation. So in the Middle East, they have a couple of artificial islands that house a hotel or a casino or a theme park that you could do. Another suggestion that we found is to use them for nuclear power, because to put a nuclear power plant on an artificial island, because people are often a bit scared of nuclear power stations because if accidents happen, they can have drastic consequences. So the farther those nuclear power plants are away from human beings, the better. So why not put them far, far away at sea? Another possibility is to use artificial islands for desalination of seawater. So to make to turn seawater into fresh water so that it can be used for drinking and sanitation and so on. Also, artificial islands could be constructed for purposes of aquaculture. So breeding of salmon, oysters, and mussels. Actually, the Netherlands does that already. Islands could also be filled with enormous frozen containers for the temporal storage of fish caught at sea. That's also an idea that is seriously entertained. So then fishermen, they can store the fish that they catch in a giant refrigerator or freezer that is situated on such artificial islands, and then at some point all these fish can be brought to shore. Artificial islands can also be used for the storage of hazardous substances or waste processing, because people prefer to have such smelly stuff as far away from their home as possible. So waste processing of hazardous, dangerous substances can also be done on an artificial island. Another suggestion that in the Netherlands we take very seriously is to build an airport at sea. Because our main airport is Schiphol Airport, is situated very close to the city of Amsterdam, and the Schiphol has sort of reached its capacity, so it cannot grow anymore. It's sort of stuck in between all these big cities. So it doesn't have the possibility to grow further. And also the territory on which the airport is now based is very expensive. So if you could use that land for constructing apartments, you could make lots of money. It's very expensive land. So that is why nowadays it might actually become feasible again to move Schiphol Airport to the sea. It's amazingly expensive to build an airport at sea. So those are crazy amounts that have been mentioned. But at some point it becomes a realistic option if the current airport cannot grow further and if the land on which it is based becomes more and more precious. Other suggestions: a rocket launch platform, data centers at sea. So Google at some point was thinking of building artificial islands to house its servers, because all our information is in the cloud, is stored in the cloud. But the cloud is actually not in the cloud. The cloud is a name for a lot of data servers that are now on land, but they could also just be floating in the oceans. And there are also less sympathetic purposes. Think of the asylum request processing centers like the one on Manus Island near Australia. So the possibilities are basically endless. Of course, there are limits. So if you cannot use an artificial island to do stuff that is in any case illegal. So you cannot use an artificial island to build a torture center, a new Guantanamo Bay. Because, well, torturing is illegal, so if you torture on an artificial island, it's still illegal. Also, you cannot, of course, produce nuclear weapons on an artificial island, because producing nuclear weapons is illegal, and if you do it on an artificial island, it doesn't make it any less illegal. So, of course, there are limits, but those limits are provided by international law more generally. So this exclusive right of coastal states to construct artificial islands, what is the consequence of this exclusivity of that right? Well, it basically means that the right to construct or authorize the construction of artificial islands in the EZ is an exclusive right, and contrary to what Article 56 might suggest, Article 60 of the Loft Sea Convention makes very clear that this right is not limited to the construction of artificial islands for economic purposes or for exploration and exploitation of natural resources, but it relates to artificial islands for all possible purposes. So artificial islands can be constructed by or with the permission of the Netherlands for every possible use, Netherlands being a coastal state. It follows from the exclusive nature of this right that no other state, at least without the permission of the coastal state, can construct an artificial island in the EZ or give another such permission, another like a corporation. Then what about the exclusivity of the jurisdiction of the coastal state over artificial islands? Well, the coastal state also has exclusive jurisdiction over all artificial islands in its EZ. That means that according to international law, the coastal state can declare all national legislation applicable to artificial islands in its EZ. So we looked at the domestic legislation of the Netherlands, and we see that there are basically two possibilities. So either you could declare in one single act all your national law applicable also to artificial islands in your EZ, but you can also add such provision to every single act that you want to be applicable in your EZ. And the Netherlands has basically chosen the latter option. So no general law, but all the specific acts that the Netherlands wants to apply on artificial islands, they are declared in that act applicable also on the artificial island. So think of acts relating to work hours, work conditions, health and safety issues, pension benefits, and so on, such laws. In addition to this legislative jurisdiction, the right to legislate with regard to artificial islands, the coastal state also has exclusive judicial and enforcement jurisdiction over artificial islands. So the policing and so on is all done exclusively by the coastal state, the maintaining law and order. So that also applies to artificial islands in private ownership and artificial islands owned by a foreign state. And so even artificial islands that basically belong to a corporation, like an oil company or an electricity company, they still fall within the jurisdiction of the coastal state. Because jurisdiction is something that belongs only to states. Non-state entities cannot exercise jurisdiction over a particular territory. But that does not mean that another state may not have jurisdiction over specific persons, conduct, or events that occur on that artificial island based on specific jurisdictional principles. It's the same on our territory. So, for example, the state of nationality of a perpetrator or a victim of a murder committed on an artificial island also has criminal jurisdiction based on the passive or active nationality principle. But that's the same with regard to the land territory. So, yeah, this may be a bit strange example, but if I kill you, then I can also be prosecuted for murder in my own state. That doesn't mean that the Netherlands has jurisdiction on Chinese territory. It just means that the Netherlands has jurisdiction over the specific act and person. And so the same rules also apply on artificial islands. With such extensive rights, exclusive right, exclusive jurisdiction, also come responsibilities. So the Netherlands is responsible for the safety of and around artificial islands in the Netherlands, EZ. So this is something that Article 60 of the Law of the Sea Convention explicitly prescribes. So the Netherlands must ensure that the safety zone around artificial islands constructed in its EZ are established, safety zones. And in those safety zones, it's basically illegal to navigate. So ships have to avoid entering those safety zones. And measures should be put in place to warn ships that they are nearing such safety zone. But also, the coastal state has a due diligence obligation to protect those on the artificial island against flooding and other natural phenomena, to provide safety in the workplace on an artificial island, so to guarantee adequate working conditions, to protect against terrorist attacks and other threats to public safety, also to protect people against crime. Basically, they have to maintain law and order on the artificial island. And there is also an obligation to ensure that an artificial island will not cause significant harm to other states or to the marine environment in general. This obligation not to cause, or this obligation to avoid artificial islands from causing harm to the environment is based on general international environmental law, but also on Part 12 of the Law of the Sea Convention, which specifically establishes such obligation. Because artificial islands are within the jurisdiction of the coastal state, the coastal state is also responsible for human rights protection on such artificial islands, regardless of who is the owner of the island or regardless of the nationality of the people involved. So if you look at human rights treaties, they always say that the state is responsible for the enjoyment of human rights, everybody within their jurisdiction. So, for example, I am now in China, and the fact that I have Dutch nationality has little consequence. So it's the Chinese government that is responsible for my enjoyment of my human rights. When I'm within the Chinese jurisdiction, it's the Chinese government that has to make sure that I can enjoy my human rights. Of course, there are certain limits. I cannot participate in political life here in China. But the most basic human rights, I enjoy them as much as Chinese nationals do. And if you come visit the Netherlands, it's the other way around. Then it's the Netherlands government that has to ensure your human rights protection. So it could be argued that artificial islands also fall within that human rights jurisdiction. So then the coastal state is responsible for the enjoyment of all human rights of those, by those that find themselves on an artificial island. So this is not based on the Loft Sea Convention, but is based on international human rights law. So then, about the rights of third states, that's the due regard issue. Article 60, let's start simple. Article 60 makes it the responsibility of the coastal state to make sure that artificial islands do not interfere with recognized sea lanes. So when the Netherlands authorizes the construction of artificial islands or wind parks in its EZ, it has to take into consideration recognized international shipping lanes. So as much as possible, the Netherlands should avoid that artificial islands are being constructed in places where those lanes go. So you have to avoid those recognized shipping lanes that are designated by the IMO. In exercising its rights and performing its duties under the convention, the coastal state must also have due regard to the rights and duties of other states. The due regard, that term is taken from Article 56, paragraph 2 of the Law of the Sea Convention. Again, what due regard exactly means is not defined in the Law of the Sea Convention, but the Chagos Archipelago Award of 18 March 2015 gives us some guidance, because there the judgment, well, at least it tells us that we have to take the particular circumstances of each and every specific case into consideration. It doesn't give us too much more to work with, but okay. So Article 56, paragraph 2 tells us that the coastal state must have due regard to the rights and duties of other states. So what are these rights and duties? Basically, they are the high seas freedoms that apply mutatis mutandis also in the exclusive economic zone. So this is based on Article 58 of the Law of the Sea Convention, which makes some of Article 87, which is about high seas freedoms, also applicable in the exclusive economic zone. So all states enjoy the freedoms of navigation and overflight, the freedom of laying of submarine cables and pipelines, and other internationally lawful uses of the sea related to those freedoms, such as those associated with the operation of ships, aircraft and submarine cables and pipelines, and compatible with the other provisions of this convention. Article 58 does not refer explicitly to the right or the freedom to construct artificial islands. That's a bit confusing, because this freedom is mentioned in Article 87, which applies to the high seas. So, let me now answer those questions that were put to us by the ministry, by way of concluding. So, who has the right to authorize the construction of artificial islands in the Netherlands EZ? Who has this right? But which state? Yeah, the Netherlands. Only the Netherlands. It's easy, yeah? Second question. What are the limits to the activities that may be allowed on an artificial island? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there are almost no limits. And the only limits, I think that is what you were referring to, is you cannot do activities that are otherwise also illegal, like torture or produce nuclear weapons and so on. But except from that, there seem to be no limits. Of course, in the way you use those artificial islands, you have to pay due regard to the rights of other states. But as long as you do so, you can do whatever you want on an artificial island. What's the definition of the term artificial island? Well, basically, in the Law of the Sea Convention, there is no definition. So it is always a bit speculation what exactly an artificial island is. So what my view that I just shared with you is basically based on scholarship. And yeah, I believe it's the better view, but if you look at scholarship, you also find people that have another view, that distinguish artificial islands and structures and installations from each other in a different way. So we basically don't know. Then how is ownership of an artificial island in the Netherlands regulated? Well, basically in the law of the coastal state, in Dutch domestic law. So it's an issue of domestic law and not international law. So the Law of the Sea Convention does not regulate a matter of ownership. So the coastal state is entitled to adopt national legislation on the matter. And the acquisition and transfer of ownership over artificial islands, as well as installations and installations for economic purposes, by the way, is governed by Dutch national law. And the same applies to other private and administrative matters concerning artificial islands. But the extraterritorial effect of the domestic law of the coastal state is not automatic. So in each legislative act, you have to add a provision saying this law also applies to the artificial islands on the EZ. Or what you could also do is make a general act which just tells you, which just says all law of the Netherlands also applies to artificial islands in its EZ. That's another possibility. So that is what I wanted to share with you, because this one we already discussed. What are the rights of third states in relation to artificial islands? Well, basically that is the due regard thing. So third states have high seas freedoms, at least some of them, based on Article 58 read in conjunction with Article 87 of the Law of the Sea Convention. And with those freedoms, the coastal state must take account, must consider them. So that is what I wanted to share with you. I guess it's now time for some questions. There's time for some questions, or okay. I'll now leave the floor to the, or give the floor back to our president.
Okay. Thank you.